A lot of civil engineering firms today are trying to grow fast, right? They're thinking about how quick can we grow, but not thinking about the long term. And our guest for today, Gil Hantzsch, President and CEO of MSA Professional Services, has some awesome advice on how you can focus, as he says, focus on building a house with bricks, not with sticks. So we've got an awesome interview with Gil we're going to jump into, but before we do, I would like to recognize our sponsor for this episode, Pennoni. Since Pennoni's founding more than 5 decades ago, their clients trust Pennoni's commitment to elevating the impact of projects in the communities they serve. By partnering with their clients, they establish relationships that create trust and longevity. Pennoni approaches the start of every project as the beginning of a collaboration. With the rapid change in technology, Pennoni's clients know they are getting innovative methods in delivering quality services for smart, sustainable, and resilient solutions. Pennoni is relentless in their aim to bring fresh perspective and new technologies. Pennoni measures achievement in innovation, efficiency, and excellence. Its milestones are bigger than any one project, and every project affects the community, no matter how large or small. For more information, visit Pennoni.com. That's Pennoni.com. All right, now I'm excited to welcome my guest onto the show for today. Gil Hantzsch is the President and CEO of MSA Professional Services. Gil, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Anthony. Great to be here.
So Gil has been on our civil engineering podcast previously, and we're happy to have him back on this show. He gave us a lot of value on that last show for all of our listeners. And Gil, why don't we get started by just telling us a little bit about MSA, where you're located, types of services you offer, size.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. MSA Professional Services, we're about a 400-person, pretty general civil, architectural planning, survey, GIS, funding, environmental, is sort of do it all. We're really built to do all the things that local, county, state governments need in a consulting firm. And so we've grown really from some pretty humble Midwest roots. I'm located in the booming metropolis of Baraboo, Wisconsin, population 12,000. Not too many in our top 300 firms in a community this size, but that's where we started in the very early 1900s. And we've just grown sort of slowly and steadily outwards from there. We're currently 17 offices in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, and Illinois. And really are looking to continue our growth on a larger scale. But that's pretty much who we are and what we do.
That's great. And, Gil, I get the chance to talk to a lot of civil engineers through the content and the training that we provide. And I know a lot of them, aspire to be leaders in their firms. And I'm just wondering, obviously you're at the highest level, and I'm just wondering, in terms of your career progression, was it something that was planned, desired, accidental? Like, talk to us about how you kind of get to the position you're in today.
Yeah, it's pretty much accidental. I hate to disappoint your listeners, but I don't know that I really ever had too many goals outside of whatever job it was that I've had to do in my career. I viewed that as the most important thing, and I was never really focused on the next thing until the next thing came along. So I started here in 1992 as a project engineer, designing wastewater treatment plants. About 2-3 years into that, somebody tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Hey, you're doing a pretty good job. We're going to make you a project manager and give you a team of people." And I said, "Okay, that sounds great. What do I need to do different?" They said, "Oh, nothing. You're doing a good job." And I realized later that that was terrible advice, because the minute you go from being an individual contributor to a supervisor of others, your world has changed. It just took me some time to figure that out. And so I did that job for 12 or 13 years, became a board member and a vice president around 2007, 2008. And it was probably around 2005 that our current president indicated to me that he thought that I might be in line to succeed him. And he started working with me a full 8 years prior to his eventual departure. And at that time, we had separate president and CEO roles. And so the president's role was very internally and operationally focused. And I felt comfortable that that was something I could do. I had zero aspirations of becoming a CEO. I didn't necessarily know what that was, but it didn't look like anything I wanted to do or frankly thought I could do. And then as the day was getting closer to the departure of the president, I said to my board, I said, I think I need some more training. I don't necessarily know I know how to be a president. I've really never even led a little league team or a Cub Scout pack or anything in my and so I did get to go to the American Council of Engineering's Senior Executives Institute, which was a 1.5 year experience to really prepare people for these highest level roles. And it blew my mind. There was a lot there that I encountered for the first time in my life. 360 reviews and personality work and really big picture thinking, and surrounded by a cohort of really excellent people. And making a longer story short, what was originally intended to be my succession in 2013 to replace the president and work alongside our CEO, it became clear to me through this experience that MSA wasn't getting the leadership that we needed. And in talking with my board, the board decided to combine the two roles of president and CEO into one, and give me those positions back in 2013. So it was sort of a half planned transition. The president side, I was pretty well prepared for. When the CEO transition came up very quickly, it wasn't really anything I was prepared for. But since then, I think I'm still learning what that job is. I've since spun off a lot of the operational roles to a COO and have allowed myself to focus on the chief executive portion of the job. And like I say, I've been doing that for 9, almost 10 years and still figuring it out. But it turned out to be actually the job that I think I was meant to do, and have really enjoyed being able to put an imprint on an organization at this level.
Yeah, that's great. And I actually think our listeners are going to be happy to hear some of that, because I think one of the fears of a lot of engineers and technical professionals is that they won't be prepared to be, a president or a CEO. They don't have the skills to do it. And I think from your response there, you didn't feel like you had the skills. Like you said, you hadn't led different kinds of organizations in the past, but you were able to, get some training, I'm sure, do a lot of work and, get yourself to where you needed to be. And you've been doing it for 10 years. So that's obviously a good track record and good result there. So I think there's some optimism there. If you're listening and you're an engineer and you really want to get to a high level leadership position, but you're thinking to yourself, kind of like Gil said, I mean, I never did that before.
Yeah. What I would say is a couple things. It's a little bit like deciding to get married or deciding to become a parent. Probably in both of those things, you might think you're not ready, but you step into it and you do it and you give it your all. And I would add to that, in becoming the CEO, I knew I had the support of the board, and I had people that believed in me and were willing to work with me and allow me to do it the way I felt it needed to be done, which was, we were coming off the heels of the Great Recession, and the company still was really struggling back in 2013 to get on its feet. And it wasn't about short-term gains and producing quick results. And again, the board was very patient. I don't think any changes that you make to generate short-term gains are going to last. They're not sustainable. And so we took the building a house of bricks versus building a house of sticks mode, and really spent several years building the foundation of a much better organization that was going to be more resilient and more able to sustain better results over a longer period of time, despite changes in the external environment. And that, I'd love to tell you I knew exactly what I was doing, but that's the way it's turning out. Not that there wasn't some moments along the way where I questioned whether what we were doing were going to generate the right results, but all of a sudden, about 5-6 years ago, things really started to fall into place. But it took fully 3+ years to rebuild the organization into one that was ready to move forward and grow and improve in terms of our profitability and our service providing. So it doesn't happen overnight, would be the other thing I would offer your listeners.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think there's a couple of lessons in there as well. Like if you're a firm leader and you're thinking about promoting technical professional or, into a managerial or even a high level managerial or leadership position, they're really going to need your support. And like Gil said, you have to kind of let them be themselves and grow into the role, but I think you also have to support them. So I think there's a pretty good balance that kind of has to happen there. And I guess kind of dovetailing a little bit, Gil, if we were to ask some of your team members, what your management style is like, how do you think they would respond to that question? What would they say?
I should probably ask them. I do think I'm collaborative. I've been in the workplace long enough to have seen some older models of management, more of the command and control type, and I certainly aspire not to be that. It can be frustrating maybe to some people if they don't get a decision right away, but I really long to make sure that we make the right decisions, and sometimes that means getting more data, getting more opinions. But I would like to think that if nothing else, they're going to view me as fair and collaborative. And one of the lessons I continue to learn is being willing to let go of more things and cede control over to them. And sometimes people want it, sometimes that makes them uncomfortable, but it's better for their development. And I think maybe that would be the other thing I would add, is interested in their development, interested in everybody being able to function at the highest and best level for them, and ultimately bring the best version of themselves to work and back home at night.
So Gil, here's another question that I want to ask you that's really important, I think, based on what's happened the last few years with everything that we've gone through with COVID and now obviously the economy, and there's all kinds of stuff going on. As a leader of a firm, how do you kind of prevent yourself from either overreacting or underreacting, especially in your communication efforts with your employees? Because they're obviously looking to you, you're the kind of the heartbeat of the company, and they're kind of going to feed off of the way that you communicate. Can you talk to us a little bit about your mindset and approach to when things like that happen and how you approach it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is one of the things that I brought to the position. And going back to your point earlier about technical people being ready for this, I mean, not every technical person is cut out to be a leader, and communication skills are an absolute must-have. You've got to be at the top of your game. You could look at the CEO as the chief communications officer, because you have so much leverage, and people read into every word I say or how I say it. So I have to be very intentional about that. So sensing what the situation demands of me, sensing what people are needing from me in the moment, whether it's a very serious message, whether I have bad news to deliver. If it's bad news, you just tell them. People don't want you to beat around the bush. Be very frank, but we still always have to be positive. And I don't mean any kind of false optimism, but even when we had our more challenging years operationally, how are we going to get better from here? Every one of these was a milestone along the journey that we were on. And I was steadfast in my belief that we were on a journey to a better place. When there's good news, we have to we have to celebrate, but we can't create, unrealistic optimism. Everything in its place. So I really try and find that middle ground. How do I keep myself from overreacting? Oftentimes, if somebody comes to my door and they come in and they close the door, I'm already going to a much darker place than what they're going to have to share with me. So when they finally share with me what they've got to share, I'm like, oh, is that all? That's not a problem. Right. It's like one of my good clients would always say, I would have some news, some bad news for her on a project about a bid or something. And I'd prepare for it. She says, Gil, are babies going to die because of this? And I said, no, babies aren't going to die because of this. And then she would say, well, then we don't have a problem. Then let's get into it. So that was one worldview. So again, really knowing that any message that you send is going to have ripple effects through the organization. And if I'm downcast and people read that, people are going to magnify that. If I'm upbeat and optimistic, people might overshoot. So if you think about some kind of an oscillating curve, the reaction of my audience is probably going to be more extreme. And I kind of have to hug to that middle ground, not to let people get, too down, but we need to confront the bad news, or too up and say, we did great, but let's put that in context of how we can still continue to improve.
No, that's great. I really like that, because I think that one of the challenges for engineering professionals in terms of continuous development is everyone wants to tell engineering professionals, whether it's through training or content, that they need to be great communicators, but not everyone tells them how to do it. And so I think that your advice there is good in that the bottom line is while you need to be sensitive to the audience and who's receiving the information, that doesn't mean you water down the information that
Yeah.
you're giving them, right? You got to tell them like it is, but you also need to be sensitive and just think through how they're going to receive it, right? It's like
Yep.
just being a little bit more strategic and having some forethought around how you're going to communicate and how they're going to respond to it. And I think that's really solid advice because I know people ask me all the time, well, how do I communicate better? And that's one good strategy.
Couple things, think about it in terms of messaging. And we really, again, I don't think it's inauthentic, but you really have to think about, if I say it this way, how is that going to be perceived? So let's really make sure we get the messaging right. Let's don't bury the lead, get the important things up front,
Mm,
but give people some context. Don't leave people hanging. And in particular, uncertainty is one of the things that really triggers a negative reaction in people. So if you're giving a message, you really better be thinking about, am I telling them everything that they need to know? Because if I only tell them half the story, they're going to make up the rest, and it's going to be a lot worse than what it really is. And people really get anxious about uncertainty. And then the coffee station time, the heads over the
mm,
cubicle, you generate all this negative energy when there's uncertainty, and that isn't helping you get projects done and get billable hours and move the organization forward. So you got to be really sensitive for the types of things that will trip people's brain, their limbic brain, to react to something that they're not getting from your communication. The other thing I would say, I've been a lifelong reader. I was blessed as a kid to enjoy reading, and my parents read to me, and I always had books around. And so for me, reading is second nature. And, literally, you can become a better communicator by osmosis through reading and
mm.
seeing how people use language and being very intentional about the words. And then I take that into my writing and edit what you wrote, reread it, and reorganize it. And again, be really intentional about what you want to say. You just can't toss things off or wing it when you're the CEO, because the risk is too great that it isn't going to come across right, despite your best intentions. And then you have cleanup work to do. So
Yeah.
reading, writing. I've encountered plenty of folks who say, "God, I'm really not much of a reader." Then you might want to make an effort and try, because there's so much benefit that you can gain, both in your communication skills plus the knowledge that you gain by investing some time in reading.
No, that's great. All great stuff there. All right. So let's pivot a little bit and talk some technology. We know that technology in the civil infrastructure world is critical. It's ever changing. There's new software every day, it seems like, in different ways to do things. Obviously, there's different size firms that have different resources to be able to invest in technology for sure. Talk a little bit about it from your perspective at MSA. How do you think through technology, keep up with it? Talk about kind of what you're doing.
Yeah. And again, it's partly through the lens of our firm being a mid-sized firm, one that is continuing to improve our business practices and get to the point where we've got funding that we can invest in technology. And I think that's now making it a priority, and not just accruing cash. It almost becomes it's a strategic question. Should I be taking the proceeds of our profits and investing them in a new company and doing more of the same things that we're doing, or do we maybe slow that roll a little bit and
Mm,
invest it in technology? So we're trying to do both, but we're being more intentional about dedicating some of that revenue to really understanding where we need to be. So for a firm our size, we aren't going to invent the next new tech thing. Certainly there are firms in our industry, the large ones are buying up data science firms, and they may very well invent the next thing. That's not realistic for a firm our size, but we do need to know absolutely what's going on. What is the leading edge? What's the bleeding edge? We don't want to be there, but we really need to know where technology is driving things. So if we think that we're looking at digital twins being the predominant model delivery in a few years, what are we doing now that's putting us on a path to do that? We've got a technology retainer with a consultant who really help us understand what's going on in our industry to allow us to make better investment decisions. And we aren't just sort of proceeding within our own four walls. without really knowing what's going on in the industry. Because frankly, technology will be a disruptor. Right now, there's a lot of things that could be automated. I can imagine a world in which you could hit the easy button and load in a topography from a drone survey and give it a few basic parameters and have the software lay out an entire sewer water system or something like that. And I'd say one of the things that's preventing that from fully happening is licensure. You have to have a human being licensed to exercise engineering judgment to do these things, but we're always one vote away from licensure being revoked as a requirement. And if that were to happen, then whether it's IBM's Watson or Amazon or Google or whomever, the technology is probably there, and they're probably working on it right now to replace a lot of the things that an engineer does. And I think over history, there's always been a fear of automation, robots replacing workers and all that. But when you look at where we're at right now, we don't have the people to deliver this massive need for infrastructure modernization. Automation would really be welcome to allow engineers to focus on their highest and best use and get more done with the people that we do have in the industry.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I'm laughing a little bit when you talked about, loading up the topography, because when I was in high school, I don't know, 25, 30 years ago, I was started doing survey work in the summers. And I remember I was holding the rod and there was an instrument person and we were holding a tape between us to get the distance.
Right.
And that wasn't even like that long ago. And
No.
now the stuff that's going on now is crazy. But I do want to go back to one thing that you said there to kind of cap that up, which is when you talked about the idea of, do we want to keep growing at the pace we're growing at, or do we want to slow just a little bit and make sure we got our infrastructure and systems in place so we can grow? And it kind of goes back to what you said earlier. Are we going to build a house with sticks or with bricks?
Right.
And I think when it comes to technology, that's a really important point to think about for those of you out there listening. Is every company's different, obviously, but I see a lot of firms these days that just want to grow, acquire firms, do stuff. And we're getting calls from some of them now saying, hey, we acquired a couple of firms and we really need to do some training because everyone's doing different things and following different procedures and we have different systems. And so it is something to really be cautious about and thoughtful about as you grow, because yes, the technology is there, but every company can invest in a certain level of technology and maybe requires a certain level of technology, but you kind of have to slow yourself down and not saying give up growth to go and get your systems in place, but just maybe prioritize it and be strategic about how you can do both.
Yeah, for sure. We talk a lot as a board about what's a sustainable rate of growth. There are firms out there, as you talked about, growing wildly through acquisition, and that might look good for a while, but there's usually a price to be paid for that. And yet we also can't not grow. There's a growth imperative, and for us, we want to grow organically as well as acquisitively above the industry median growth rate. We think we can do that, but we're also not saying it needs to be 25% per year because we think that would put us in a bad place. So to me, a lot of this comes down to the role of the CEO's job is to find the appropriate balance between short-term and long-term thinking. Right? We've got a one-year plan, and we absolutely have to hit our financial plan for this year. And so we're really focusing on that short term. But I've got my operating folks to do that. I need to be thinking on the longer term things that might actually reduce our profitability in this year so that 3 years from now, we're able to grow or be more profitable, or hopefully both. And so that's the constant push-pull, I think, that goes on in my mind, and is frankly the most difficult thing to know exactly how to get that mix right of what do I do to honor the need to perform today, but also make sure that we've got this future. Because I think it's really easy to have a company that does everything well in the short term, and you can do that for a few years, but all of a sudden it catches up to you, and you're either going to take a drastic hit to profitability, or more likely you're going to sell to somebody else. You're going to say, hey, look at this great profitability we got. We're worth 6 times that, but you're going to have to buy us and make the investments that we didn't make.
Right.
And so, the ideal, we're in this for the long game. We're 100% ESOP owned, and we intend to be a generational company. And so there is no short selling the future for today's benefit. Everything is really thinking years and years ahead to make sure that the company is sustainable and successful years from now. In fact, I've heard it said, that a CEO gets paid for the decisions they made 3 years ago. And I think
Yeah.
it's a really good lens for a CEO to view their job through.
Yeah, no, that's great. And yeah, it's true. I mean, we have a business coach here at EMI, and when we're growing quickly, of course, with our clients, and he told me, like, listen, if your company triples in the next year or two, what's going to break? Look at your operation systems and figure out what's going to break and make sure it doesn't break, right? Just in other words, thinking about where you're going to need to, be smarter with systems and things of that nature. So I think it's a good way to approach it. I think, Gil's point of having a short-term plan and a long-term plan is really important. I think people sometimes do one or the other, and that can.
Yeah, when I came into the role, the company only had a 1-year plan.
Yeah, there you go.
And so when I learned that, and we have to be out independently valued because we're an ESOP, and I was talking to our valuation firm, and he said, yeah, usually we get a 3 to 5 year plan on which to base the valuation, but you guys don't have that. And I'm like, okay, well, we're going to fix that.
You talked already about, the whole idea that there's definitely a shortage of professionals in our industry for the amount of work that has to be done. And of course, we have the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that's now going to be bringing more funds, which means more infrastructure work to be done in an industry where we're already kind of up against the wall, if you will, in terms of trying to get our projects done. Do you think, and you kind of mentioned it already, but we can revisit it again. You mentioned, AI and maybe having software and technology that can help us. Do you think that that's going to be one of the keys for us to be able to try to navigate this problem?
To a certain degree, but I don't think, Anthony, it's going to arrive quickly enough.
Mm,
We're staring at this mountain of funding, and when I say mountain, I'm thinking of a particular graphic I've seen that I can share with you that McKinsey put together that showed the increase in construction put in place dollars over the next 10 years. And basically between 2022 and 2027, that number is increasing over what ordinarily would have been experienced because of the IIJA, sort of peaking out in 2027. But even though we think of it as a 5-year authorization of funding, that money is in the system, and it takes years to get finally to the point where it's construction being put in place. So although that amount starts to come back down off that peak, we're seeing impacts to our industry out to 2032, 2033 as a result of this funding, over and above what would ordinarily have been expected. So we're really looking at like a 10-year bubble. And so as I think about, wow, how are, the American Council of Engineering Companies said this funding program is great. It's going to create 82,000 new jobs in the engineering industry. And everybody said, that's awesome. Where are they coming from? And I don't know that there is, I would say at best, civil engineering programs, architecture programs, maybe they're holding their own. Some universities are growing, some are struggling. Kids have so many other opportunities of things to go into, right? You've got biomedical engineering, you got computer engineering. There's some things that are a lot sexier sounding than civil engineering might sound. So I don't know that the cavalry is going to come over the hill in terms of a batch of new engineers ready to deliver this infrastructure package. So technology will have a role, but technology takes years to go from the bleeding edge, through the trough of disillusionment and into really productive acceptance. And so what I think is kind of going to happen reminds me of what we talked about in the early days of COVID. If you remember, when COVID was this new thing back in March of 2020, there's a lot of people with some really accurate predictions about, without any mitigation measures, we're going to see this huge spike in cases. It's going to overwhelm hospitals and all those dire consequences. And they talked about flattening the curve. Social distancing, masking, ultimately vaccines were all intended to not necessarily keep you from getting it, but create a less acuteness in that spike. So they talked about taking this big acute spike and spreading it out over a longer period of time, where it wasn't quite, the numbers weren't so high at any one time, so we didn't overwhelm our hospitals. So I go back to this figure of what the IIJ funding rolling out looks like, and I think there's going to be some natural flattening of the curve, both from the AE industries supply constraints, but also the construction industry. We're seeing fewer and fewer bidders on every job right now. The dance cards of the contractors are full. Every contractor that I talk to tells the same story about finding people that are willing to work. They hire 10 people, 5 of them show up for the first day, and if one of them sticks around beyond the first week, that's a win.
Wow.
So I think the industry as a whole, engineers, architects, contractors, are really going to have difficulty delivering according to that chart. So if we can make sure that that money stays in the pipeline long enough and maybe sustains us beyond this, up for 5 years, down for 5 years, but creates more of a plateau that lasts over a longer period of years. Because my other fear is Congress will probably think that they did their job in fixing the infrastructure problems in the US because of this big funding package. And all they really did was make it less bad than it was. But you get to the end of the cycle, there's always an ongoing need for more investment. And so I worry about the distaste for infrastructure funding, the natural backlash that occurs. So if we can get this to a more sustainable long-term funding level that we can deliver without burning our people out, and frankly, that the government even has the ability to deliver, I think it's been slow coming out of the gate. And part of that, I'm guessing, has to do with government's ability even to break this loose and get this out, because it's such a massive undertaking.
Yeah, no, I hear you. Listen, the stormwater skills inside of me are saying it's kind of like when you have flooding and you say, hey, let's just open up the stream, widen the culvert, right? That's great. But then what's going to happen downstream? And I think that's what the government says, hey, we give you the funding, now figure out how to get it working. And we're all saying, but certainly it's going to be challenging and interesting times. And another thing that I'll throw at you here, kind of tied into all of this, is also stemming from COVID, of course, is the whole idea of this remote work, which is a whole nother thing that, firms have been dealing with over the past couple of years now, some better than others. But just curious as to MSA's approach with, people virtual, in person, like how have you kind of navigated that situation?
Sure. In talking to a lot of people, both inside and outside the organization over the last couple of years, it's really become clear to me that everyone had a different experience during the pandemic, and in particular during the period of time that most of us closed our offices and went to remote work. For some people, they saw, man, this really works for me. I can focus and I can get a lot done, and this really works for me. Other people said, man, I really miss people and I want to be back in the office. And so as I talked to other CEOs and firms were trying to figure out the new roadmap as we were looking to sort of come out of COVID, there was a lot of folks talking about a program of, well, you're 3 days in, you're 2 days out, and things like that. And I think what struck me is that one size fits all just isn't going to work equally well for everyone. So we went into it giving the direction to our supervisors. You really need to talk to each person on your team, find out what works for them, but also communicate to them what you need from them. So maybe they think they want to be 100% remote worker, but you don't think they were as effective as they think they were, or you need them in more to be around some other folks. Have that conversation and make sure you get out of them what you need, but also be willing to trust them. There are some people that it really worked well. And there was some consternation amongst our leaders. They didn't feel equipped, or they didn't feel comfortable having those conversations. But all I can tell you, Anthony, is there was a lot of trepidation about how well is this going to work. And I'll give you a couple of data points. Our performance as a company has just continued to improve throughout this whole period. And I don't just mean expenses going away. Everybody experienced a bump to their bottom line by travel expenses disappearing, but I mean our productivity and other measures. So I don't think it's harmed us to have embraced sort of flexible hybrid remote work on a case-by-case basis. Some people are back in the office all the time. Some are 100% remote, but they come in when they need to. And nothing generally has made it up to my radar. Now, I always laugh when I tell people I used to have a grapevine, but it's kind of rotten now. So I don't get as much information by the grapevine anymore as I once did. but I'm not hearing any major stories of this not working. I'm sure there probably are some incidents where people are still trying to work with an employee to arrive at a flexible working arrangement that works for both parties. But by and large, it seems to have kind of been a non-event, at least compared to what we expected and feared. And so I feel pretty good about where we landed. And again, I talk in terms of a bell curve of we're sort of in the middle here with this flexible, there isn't any one rule. There are clearly firms that are going all in on remote work and don't want to see people back and are divesting themselves of real estate. And then you've got some firms that are saying, we are better together. We need butts in the seats. And if you're going to work here, you're going to be here. And frankly, it was one of those environments. There's a young woman structural engineer that works for us now. She was in an environment where they wanted her back in, and she was not ready to do that. And we offered her a flexible remote work arrangement, and she's come in and done absolutely fantastic to the point where she now is taking over a team and is a leader that we would not otherwise have had some other firm chosen to really adhere to a standard of getting everybody in. And maybe that's what they felt they needed to do.
Mm.
But we benefited in that case from being able to meet her needs.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. And I think, and I think it's not to say that obviously, MSA's way is the right way, right? I think it's different for every company 100% in this flexible work environment situation. But I do think, to Gil's point, you have to evaluate kind of the benefits, the consequences again of the approach that you take. And I think one of the benefits of the flexible approach definitely is your ability to recruit people, either people that can't find a flexible situation that they want to have, or it could also open up your geographic range for hiring. If you have, much more flexible remote operations, you're not necessarily limited to your state or your region specifically to hire a professional. If you need someone with a certain kind of expertise, your kind of your range or your area is going to be broadened. So I think it's a situation that you have to think about for your own company. But I do think that the more flexible you can be, it's going to be better because everyone approaches this differently. So if you're a firm with 300 employees, they're not all going to think the same way about it. So, if you pick one or the other, you're going to definitely upset a certain number of people. So I think just being smart about thinking about your approach and the consequences. And quite frankly, Gil mentioned this a few times already today. Talk to your people, take a heartbeat on them, understand what they're thinking. Similar to like what you talked about, Gil, when you're going to deliver something to someone, how are they going to respond to it? I think it's always good to get and kind of take the pulse of your people and see what they think, and then go from there, because these are all situations that are in flux, if you will, and probably will be for some time.
And they will be. That's just it. I mean, the rate of change and our ability as leaders to adapt to it. We don't get to say, gosh, I wish this hadn't happened. It happened, and now we have to deal with it. And there's more and more uncertainty in the situations we're dealing with it. So there's an awful lot of feeling like we're out on a high wire, but making the best decisions that we can. And I think our industry as a whole, I think, has made it through this last few years really well. There's a lot of good leaders in this industry.
Yeah, for sure. And we've helped a couple of companies kind of sketch out these flexible work kind of guidelines, if you will, kind of like an attachment to their employee manual. And the one thing I'll say about it is we've been very intentional, and they've been very intentional about telling people this is a dynamic document. It's not something that's set in stone, ship it out. It's probably going to change very, very regularly because everything is kind of in flux a little bit still. So I think just keeping that in mind is going to be beneficial for anyone who's approaching these things. Gil, let me ask you a little bit about diversity and inclusion. It's a real big topic in the industry today with good merit. I think there's lots of benefits to diversity and inclusion, especially from a perspective standpoint. Talk a little bit about kind of MSA's approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how you look at that and how you incorporate that.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. We're on a journey like everybody else. We're still fairly early in our journey, but it got onto my radar through some association I've had with the industry back in 2019. And so we brought in a former CEO of an engineering firm, who was a woman who had had a very successful career, to start working with our female employees to really help us understand what their experience has been. And that was sort of the beginning of it through that lens of diversity. I got to admit to you, we're not nearly as diverse as I would like us to be, or as we need to be, in terms of if we want to focus on racial diversity. And again, there's many aspects to diversity. So that's something in 2020, then, really in the wake of George Floyd's murder, and my really understanding how ill-equipped I was to deal with that. That was sort of the beginning of our journey. And we've since put together a committee and trying to put more power for what we do into the hands of that group. And again, like any effort in a professional services firm, we've got people, we're telling them, well, you need to be utilized, but you need to also do this other stuff. And we're finding our way. We did some outreach events with some STEM related activities for underserved communities that we did in 2022 and are planning more for this year. And just through talking about it, sharing from our committee, bringing in speakers to talk about those experiences, just opening up the dialogue has made more people aware that whatever we might have done in the past, because we're in a part of the country that is got a lot less racial diversity than many other parts of the country. And we're in an industry that, when I came in, it was kind of a white male thing. And that's changing and needs to change. And so those aren't excuses. In fact, I looked at the demographics of all of the communities in which we have offices. Every single one of them. I don't care if you're in rural northern Wisconsin, your community is more diverse than our company. And then I looked at the statistics on civil engineers graduating. The percentage of civil engineering degrees conferred to white males is going down. And so these are all things that are saying those weren't good excuses ever, but they're not an excuse at all in terms of why we are the way we are. So in talking about these things, I think people in the past might have said, that name on that resume doesn't sound like somebody that might fit with my clients. Well, I think people have realized that no, everybody, if they're qualified, they need to be in the candidate pool. And once they're in the candidate pool, we will still hire the best people. But I've seen the company's diversity increasing even since we've just begun talking about this a couple of years ago. I've seen people's willingness to acknowledge that, my experience growing up as a white dude in the upper Midwest is not the same as everybody else's around me. And that might color my view as to how well this organization is working. This culture probably works very well for me. It might not work the same for women or for people of minorities status. And so we need to really examine, are we as inclusive as we think we are? And so those are all of the discussions that are going on. And then maybe that's the other thing I'll say, Anthony, is in bringing in a consultant and helping us understand, if the goal is to get more diverse, the answer isn't go out and hire a group of people that don't look like me. Because if you don't make some fundamental changes to the culture first, they aren't gonna be happy. They aren't gonna stick around. So we've really been trying to focus primarily on the inclusion piece. If we have an organization that is inclusive and provides equitable opportunities, regardless of who you are, and we do those things, the diversity will sort of occur more naturally, and it's going to be sustainable. Those folks are going to hang around and said, hey, this is a culture that's welcoming for me. And so those are all the things that we're really trying to do, and learn on the fly. I think, like every organization, is on how best to do that. But the simple answer is, with the demands and the talent shortage, even if somebody, the views are all over the map on this, but if you're looking at what's best for the business, is to change and get more people in the door, regardless of their background or what they look like. But that's where the talent pool is moving. It's going to be more diverse. And as one of the great benefits is, greater diversity in people's background is going to create greater diversity in their thinking, which is really just another way of helping innovation occur. Yeah. So I think there's so many angles in it for people to get on the bandwagon as to why MSA and companies in our industry really need to be intentional and continuing to focus on becoming more inclusive, equitable, and as a result, diverse. Um, that we're all committed to doing it. And the challenge is always we've got 15 things we're trying to accomplish. And where does this fit in relative to our growth, our technology, right? They're all competing for some of the same resources. And so it's finding a way to make sure that that is, we're going into a strategic planning effort right now. It needs to be elevated to the level as being part of that plan, that we're really being intentional. So again, that's the journey that we're on. I would like to say we're there, but we're never going to be there. It's the journey that will never end.
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of the stuff we talked about today, it's going to be in flux and it's going to be changing. And I think the important things there that you said that I think people really have to think about is it is something that all firms are dealing with. And I think you have to be aware and you have to understand the current situation. Like you mentioned, you're looking at data in your communities, you're trying to understand what's going on so you can make the best decisions. And going back to the same theme we're running here in this episode, build a house with bricks, not sticks. You want to make sure you're incorporating some of these things before you go out and are just hiring a more diverse population that may come in and not feel comfortable. And you want to make sure that they're going to be there for the long term and that diversity is going to be there for the long term. So I really like that a lot. And I really think
Yeah.
that that's kind of our theme here, building a
Yep.
sustainable firm.
Yep. Short-term results is not the way to do that. It really is. Again, I think glad you called it back to that. It's about taking the long view. We aren't going to get there overnight, 1 year, 2 year, 3 years. To me, and I don't like even trying to set goals for these things. My goal is always, are we better than we were? Are we going in the right direction? And as long as we're doing that on all of these things, diversity, financial metrics, growth, then I know we're going to get where we're going to get someplace good if we just keep doing that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Gil Hantzsch, President and CEO, MSA Professional Services. I want to thank you so much for spending some time with us here on the Civil Engineering CEO. You talked a lot about the biggest challenges we're all facing in the civil engineering industry today and gave, I think, some great thoughts on how we can approach them. So thank you so much, Gil. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Anthony. It's just been a pleasure being part of this industry for as long as I have. There's a lot of really great inspirational firms and people. And what I probably love most about this industry is the collegiality and the sharing that occurs between firms that some days we compete, some days we partner. We might work in different parts of the country and people are really willing to share. So much of what I've gained in figuring out how to do this job over the last 10 years is just simply by building and cultivating a network of others who are willing to help me. And then when I can help others, taking that opportunity. So appreciate this opportunity.
All right. Thank you, Gil. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Gil. Gil is awesome. He's come on our channels before. He's given great advice to engineering professionals, and that's why he is a president and CEO today. Please consider subscribing to our channel here. We put out videos like this on a weekly basis to help engineers become better managers and leaders. I'll see you next week.